Is that the best you can do, old man? Liam's voice was sharp, his tone laced with mockery. The other soldiers around him chuckled, the sound filling the air like a cruel symphony. Eddie Grant, 78 years old and a veteran of wars long past, didn't flinch. He stood at the edge of the shooting range, hands steady on his rifle. His back was straight, his expression unreadable, but inside, his mind was as sharp as the day he first picked up a weapon. The younger soldiers around him, fresh out of basic training, didn't know who they were dealing with. Eddie's grip tightened on the rifle, but he didn't raise it just yet. He took a slow breath, the wind brushing against his face. "You're wasting your time, Pops," Liam continued, his voice dripping with arrogance. "No one's impressed by an old man pretending to be a sharpshooter." Eddie didn't respond. He wasn't there to prove anything to Liam. He was here for his own reasons, reasons none of these young men could possibly understand. The gunfire from the nearby range echoed as Liam raised his own weapon, hitting the target with ease. His friend slapped him on the back, laughing. Eddie adjusted his stance, the familiar feeling of the rifle resting against his shoulder bringing back memories of another time. A time when the world was much harsher, and survival meant knowing exactly when to pull the trigger. He took another deep breath and aimed. The target was set at 500 yards. Eddie's hands never shook, his eyes never wavered. He squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, but the target remained untouched. Liam and the others burst into laughter, their voices ringing through the air. "Looks like the old man still can't hit the mark," Liam taunted, his smirk wide. Eddie didn't react. He simply lowered the rifle and turned to face the young men, his expression unchanged. "It's just a warm-up," he said quietly, his voice carrying a calm weight. He didn't need to explain himself. The laughter continued, but it began to lose its edge. The soldiers around him were starting to notice something. Something in the way Eddie carried himself. The way his eyes, though aged, held a quiet fire. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to learn. Liam stepped forward, still laughing. "You really think you're a match for me, old man?" he scoffed. Eddie didn't answer. Instead, he lifted the rifle again, his aim steady. He took another deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The rifle's recoil was nothing to him. He squeezed the trigger again, and this time, the shot hit dead center. The target didn't just move, it practically exploded, the force of the bullet tearing through it like a hot knife through butter. For a split second, the laughter stopped. Eddie lowered the rifle slowly, watching as the reality of what had just happened settled in. Liam's jaw dropped, and the group fell silent. Eddie wasn't just a veteran, he was a legend. The range officer, a man named Chris, walked up to the target, checking the damage. "I don't believe it," he muttered under his breath. He looked at Eddie, his expression shifting from curiosity to respect. "You didn't miss, did you?" Eddie just smiled faintly. "No, I didn't miss." The young soldiers were no longer laughing. They were staring, some with mouths agape, others with a newfound respect in their eyes. Liam, now pale, took a step back. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eddie looked at him, his eyes steady, and simply said, "I'm someone who's been where you haven't. I've seen things you'll never understand." As the silence stretched on, the young soldiers began to realize the truth. Eddie Grant wasn't just an old man. He was a legend who had lived 1,000 lives in the heat of battle. And now, they would never forget him. As the laughter faded, Eddie stood still, watching the young soldiers around him. The arrogance had disappeared from Liam's face, replaced by something Eddie couldn't quite place, fear or maybe awe. Eddie didn't care to figure it out. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here because, despite all the years, all the battles, the pain, there was still something left inside him, something these young men needed to understand. Liam hesitated before speaking again, his voice quieter this time. "Who are you really?" Eddie turned his gaze to him, calm, but with an edge that only someone who had survived war could possess. "I told you," Eddie replied, his voice low. "I'm someone who's been where you haven't. I've seen things you'll never understand." Liam's mouth opened, but no words came out. The others shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing they had crossed the line. The range officer, Chris, walked up to Eddie, his face now full of respect, though his tone remained professional. "I've seen some incredible shots in my time, but that was something else. You've been doing this longer than you let on." Eddie didn't respond, his hands still resting on the rifle, its weight familiar. He looked out across the range, the memories of countless battles rushing back. In that moment, Eddie wasn't just the old man with a rifle. He was the man who had once saved lives, fought for his brothers in arms, and stood on the front lines when the world was chaos. "You're not just some old soldier, are you?" Chris added, almost as if asking himself the question more than Eddie. Eddie let the silence stretch out, then simply nodded. "I'm not." The group of young soldiers had now gathered around, their earlier mockery replaced by an uneasy silence. Their faces were unreadable, but the shift was unmistakable. Liam, who had once thought of Eddie as nothing more than a relic, now seemed to consider the man in front of him with a new perspective. "What's it like?" Liam asked quietly. "What's it really like out there?" Eddie's eyes flicked to him, and for a moment, the weight of his past seemed to fill the space between them. "It's not about what it's like," Eddie said, his voice steady. "It's about what you're willing to do when it counts. It's about being there when no one else can. When your brothers need you, and you have no choice but to give everything." There was no bragging in Eddie's words, no grandstanding. Just the simple truth of someone who had lived through hell and made it out the other side. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, and the distant sounds of gunfire faded into the background. "I'm sorry," Liam said, his voice small now. I didn't know." Eddie looked at him, the young man's face now open and sincere. "You couldn't have known," Eddie said. "But now you do. Remember this. It's not about the shot you make. It's about what you do when everything is on the line." Eddie's words lingered in the air, and for the first time that day, there was a real understanding between them. The soldiers weren't just seeing Eddie as the old man with a rifle anymore. They were seeing him as the legend he truly was, the veteran who had earned his place, who had fought and survived, and who would never be forgotten. The sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows over the range as Eddie stood there, his rifle resting against his shoulder. The young soldiers who had once mocked him were now standing in a respectful silence, their eyes no longer filled with arrogance, but with something else. A quiet realization. Eddie could feel the weight of their gaze, but it didn't matter to him. He had never needed their approval. What mattered was the lesson. "What now?" Liam asked, breaking the silence. His voice was tentative, softer than before. "Now," Eddie repeated, his voice steady. "Now, you take what you've learned here today and remember it. You may think you know what it means to be tough, to be strong, but it's not about the rifle, the uniform, or the medals. It's about what you're willing to do when the stakes are high." The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and dust. Eddie could almost hear the distant sounds of battle in the wind, a memory triggered by the calm of the moment. The stillness of the range reminded him of the many quiet moments before the storm, the moments when everything was about to change. Liam looked at him, uncertainty still in his eyes. "But you've seen so much. How do you keep going? After everything?" Eddie turned his gaze towards him, his expression unreadable. "You keep going because you have no choice. You don't get to stop. Not when people depend on you. Not when your brothers are counting on you to hold the line. You do it because that's what being a veteran means. It's not about how many times you've been knocked down. It's about how many times you get back up." The silence lingered, hanging heavy in the air. The young soldiers around him were digesting his words, each one taking them indifferently. Some looked down, perhaps feeling a pang of guilt for their earlier disrespect. Others were just trying to understand. But Eddie wasn't here to be understood. He was here to pass on a simple truth. "You'll understand one day," Eddie continued, his voice softening. "Maybe. Not now. Maybe not tomorrow. But one day you'll face something that will make you question everything. And when that happens, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember that it's not about the things you carry, it's about what you leave behind." Liam seemed to reflect on his words, his face thoughtful now, no longer the cocky grin of a young man trying to prove himself. "I don't know if I'll ever be like you," Liam admitted quietly. Eddie nodded, his expression unchanged. "You don't have to be. Just be the best version of yourself when it counts. That's all you can do." The group stood there in silence for a while longer, the weight of Eddie's words settling in. They didn't fully understand yet, but they were closer. Eddie could see it in their eyes, the spark of something they hadn't had before. A quiet respect. He didn't need them to thank him, didn't need any grand gestures. What mattered was that they had learned. And in the end, that was all that mattered to him. As the light began to fade, Eddie turned away from the range, the the young soldiers slowly following behind him. They didn't need to speak anymore. The lesson had been learned. And for Eddie, that was enough. The day had begun to cool as Eddie and the young soldiers made their way off the range. The clinking of their gear was the only sound accompanying their footsteps. The weight of the day's lessons hung in the air, but Eddie wasn't interested in the pat on the back or the show of respect from these young men. He had done what he came here to do. They would carry it with them, in their own way, from this point forward. Liam walked alongside Eddie, his steps slower than the others, as if hesitant to break the silence. "You know," Liam began, his voice quieter than usual, "I thought I had it all figured out. The discipline, the training, all that. But you made me realize there's more to it." Eddie turned his head slightly, his expression softening just enough to show he was listening. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice calm, like he was sharing a simple piece of wisdom. Liam hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. "I thought being tough was just about strength, you know? About being the best on the field. But today, I saw something different in you. It wasn't about being the best. It was about holding your ground when it matters most." Eddie nodded, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "That's right. Toughness isn't about how much you can push. It's about knowing when to hold back, when to let things come to you. It's not about proving something to anyone, but proving it to yourself." Liam looked over at Eddie, a new sense of respect in his eyes. "I get it now. It's not about the medals or the victories. It's about what you carry with you, the part that doesn't show." Eddie chuckled softly, the sound low and steady. "Exactly. All the awards in the world won't matter if you can't stand up for what you believe in. It's the silent strength, the kind that doesn't make noise but is felt by those around you." They walked in silence for a moment, each lost in thought. The others had gone ahead, eager to leave the range behind them, but Eddie and Liam remained, sharing an unspoken understanding. As they approached the barracks, Eddie paused, glancing at the young man beside him. "You'll have days where everything feels like it's slipping away. Days when it feels like the weight is too much to carry. But remember what you learned today. The real battle is never with others. It's with yourself." Liam nodded, his eyes now serious, the kind of seriousness that came with a new understanding. "I won't forget this, Eddie. I'll remember." Eddie looked at him, his gaze steady, unwavering. "I know you will." With that, they entered the barracks, the noise of the others rising up around them. But for Eddie and Liam, there was a quiet peace. The lesson had been passed on, and that was enough. The days that followed felt different for Liam and the rest of the group. The camaraderie that had once been built on youthful bravado was now tinged with respect, a respect earned not through words, but through action and understanding. Eddie didn't change. He wasn't the kind of man who sought praise or recognition. He simply went about his days, moving with the quiet strength that had defined him for decades. The young soldiers noticed the difference in themselves, too. They began to see the world through a new lens. One where strength was measured not just by what you could do, but by when you chose to act. One afternoon, as the sun began to set behind the barracks, Liam found himself sitting on the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He hadn't spoken to Eddie much since that day on the range, but something inside him had shifted. The young man was no longer filled with the sense of invincibility that had once marked him. Instead, there was a quiet calm. The same calm that Eddie seemed to exude. He sat there, thinking back to the words Eddie had shared with him. The real battle is never with others. It's with yourself. The words echoed in his mind. He had always been driven by the need to prove something, to show that he was better, stronger, faster. But Eddie had shown him that strength wasn't always about showing what you could do. It was about knowing when to be still. It was about having the confidence to stand firm, no matter what. As Liam sat there, lost in thought, Eddie appeared beside him, his footsteps light but steady. "You doing all right?" Eddie asked, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that it always did. Liam turned to face him, a small smile forming on his lips. "Yeah, just thinking. About everything you said." Eddie nodded, as if expecting that answer. "You'll get there, kid," he said, the weight of the words not lost on Liam. "It takes time, but you'll get there." Liam looked up at Eddie, his eyes now filled with a new understanding. "Thanks, Eddie. You really changed the way I see things." Eddie gave him a small, approving nod. "I didn't change anything, Liam. You did. You just needed someone to remind you of what was already inside you." With that, Eddie walked off, leaving Liam with his thoughts once more. For the first time in a long time, Liam felt at peace. He had a long way to go, but he knew now that the journey wasn't about trying to prove himself to others. It was about becoming the person he could be proud of when no one else was watching. As Eddie disappeared into the distance, Liam stood up, feeling the weight of his future settle into place. He wasn't the same person he had been when he first arrived, and though the road ahead would be difficult, he knew that he was finally ready to walk it. The weeks passed by, and life at the barracks settled into a new rhythm. The early morning drills, the hum of training exercises, and the quiet moments of reflection became routine. But for Liam, everything had changed. He found himself thinking less about proving himself and more about the kind of man he wanted to become. Eddie's words still echoed in his mind. The real battle is never with others. It's with yourself. Those words had settled deep within him, reshaping how he approached every challenge. One afternoon, as Liam sat alone on the porch, the sound of boots on gravel broke his thoughts. He looked up to see Eddie walking towards him, the same steady gait, the same quiet presence. Without saying a word, Eddie sat down beside him. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. They simply sat in silence, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink. Finally, Eddie broke the silence. "You've changed," he said, his voice as calm as always. Liam glanced over at him, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah," he replied after a pause. "I guess I have." Eddie nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good. That's the first step." Liam thought back to the young man who had arrived at the base months ago. He had been brash, eager to prove himself, hungry for recognition. Now, he wasn't so sure of anything, but in a way, that was the point. He no longer felt the need to rush through life, to push so hard against every obstacle. Instead, he felt something quieter, something steadier inside him. He was learning to move through life with intention, to choose his battles, and to stand his ground when it mattered. "I don't think I'll ever be like you," Liam said, his voice low. "I mean, you've seen so much, done so much." Eddie turned to him, his gaze steady. "You don't have to be like me, Liam. Just be yourself. The best version of yourself. That's enough." Liam absorbed the words, feeling their weight. He had spent so much time trying to fit into someone else's idea of strength, but now, he was beginning to realize that true strength came from knowing who you were, and being comfortable with that. As the sun continued its descent, the two men sat in companionable silence, the distance between them filled with mutual understanding. Liam wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready for whatever came next. He had a long way to go, but now, he understood that it wasn't about rushing to the end. It was about moving through life with purpose, with respect for himself and for others. Eddie's influence had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully explain, but the change was real, and it was something he carried with him. When Eddie finally stood to leave, Liam nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. "Thanks, Eddie," he said quietly. Eddie didn't say anything in return. He simply nodded and walked away, the sound of his boots fading into the distance. Liam watched him go, a sense of peace settling over him. He wasn't the same person who had come to the base. He was becoming something else, something stronger, something more sure of himself. And for the first time, that was enough. The mornings had become a bit quieter for Liam, a small part of him still processing the changes he'd undergone. The drills still happened, the camaraderie still existed, but now, when he walked through the halls or sat in the mess hall, he noticed things he hadn't before. He noticed the way the younger soldiers interacted, how they rushed through their days without thinking, eager to prove themselves. He saw himself in them, the impatience, the hunger for validation. But now, it all felt a little less important. One afternoon, while on break, Liam sat by himself, staring out at the field where the rest of the team was training. His mind wandered back to the conversation he'd had with Eddie weeks ago, about finding strength within and knowing when to step back. Liam was starting to grasp the depth of it. Strength wasn't about the bravado or the challenges you overcame in front of others. It was about resilience, the ability to keep moving forward even when no one was watching, to hold your ground when it mattered most. Eddie had made him see that. The older man had lived through more than Liam could ever imagine, and yet, Eddie never wore his experiences like a badge. He didn't need to. He simply was who he was. "You okay?" A voice interrupted Liam's thoughts. He looked up to see Rob standing there, his expression a bit uncertain. The younger man had been one of the soldiers who had laughed at Eddie on the range, but now, things seemed different. Rob had changed, too. Yeah, Liam replied, giving a small smile. Just thinking about things. Rob sat down beside him, quiet for a moment, before speaking again. You know, I never really understood what Eddie was trying to teach us. But now, I think I'm starting to get it. It's not about the fastest or the toughest. It's about knowing when to stand still and when to move. Liam nodded, impressed. Rob had never been one to reflect on such things before, but now, there was a calm about him that wasn't there before. Exactly, Liam said, his voice steady. It's not always about what you can do. Sometimes, it's about what you choose not to do. Rob looked at him, his expression thoughtful. You think we're ready for that kind of responsibility? Liam looked out at the others still training. The answer wasn't clear, not fully, but he knew they were getting there. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but each day, they were a little bit closer. I think we'll get there, Liam said quietly. We have to keep learning. It's not about proving ourselves to anyone else anymore. It's about who we become when no one's watching. Rob fell silent, looking out at the field. For the first time in a long time, he didn't look like a man trying to prove something. He looked like someone who understood that the journey was more important than the destination. As the evening approached, Liam stood up, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't the same person who had arrived at the base. He was someone who understood the quiet strength Eddie had tried to teach him, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. And as the days passed, he felt more and more ready to embrace the path ahead. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew he was finally ready to walk it. As the weeks passed, Liam found himself more in tune with the changes within him. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was genuinely learning, genuinely becoming someone different. He noticed his interactions with the other soldiers had shifted, too. He no longer felt the need to compete with them, to prove that he was stronger or faster. Instead, he found himself quietly offering advice, taking a step back when it was needed, and leading by example. It wasn't a role he had expected to take on, but it was one that felt natural now. One morning, the sound of boots echoed down the hall as Liam made his way to the mess hall. He saw Eddie sitting alone at a table. As usual, his presence calm and unassuming. Liam approached, his footsteps purposeful but not rushed. Mind if I sit? Liam asked. Eddie looked up, his eyes steady but warm. Not at all, he replied with a slight nod. Liam sat down across from him, the noise of the room fading slightly as he focused on the older man. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both content with the silence. Finally, Liam broke the stillness. You know, I think I get it now. What you were trying to teach us. Eddie's gaze didn't shift, but a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Takes some time, doesn't it? Liam nodded. I thought I had to be the best, prove myself to everyone. But now, it's not about that. It's about being someone I can respect, whether anyone else does or not. Eddie's smile grew a little. That's the point. You're not in competition with anyone else. The only person you need to prove anything to is yourself. Liam sat back in his chair, processing the weight of the words. He had come to understand the truth in them over the past weeks, but hearing them again from Eddie made them feel even more real. It's hard, though, Liam admitted. Letting go of that need to show everyone I'm strong. I guess it's a lot easier said than done. Eddie met his eyes, his expression steady, yet understanding. It is hard, but strength isn't just about showing off. Real strength is in the quiet moments. It's in knowing when to step forward and when to step back. It's knowing your limits and still standing tall when it matters. Liam thought about the last few months, about the way he had changed, and the way he saw his fellow soldiers. He wasn't the same person who had walked through the doors of the barracks all that time ago. He was stronger now, but not in the ways he had once imagined. It wasn't about the loud, brash strength he'd thought was important. It was the quiet strength of knowing who you were, of finding peace within yourself. You know, Liam said after a long pause, I think I'm finally starting to understand what you mean. It's not about trying to be something you're not. It's about being who you are, fully and completely. Eddie gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving Liam's. Exactly. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the kind that came with mutual understanding, the kind that only grew through shared experience. Liam had learned so much from Eddie, not just about strength, but about life itself. As they finished their breakfast, Liam stood up, a sense of purpose settling over him. He wasn't the same man who had arrived at the base, and he was beginning to see that the journey ahead wasn't about proving himself to others. It was about growing into the man he knew he could be, the man he wanted to be. Eddie watched him go, and for the first time, Liam felt that he wasn't just walking this path for himself. He was walking it for the others, too. And that was enough. The days blended into weeks, and the rhythm of daily life at the base continued. Yet for Liam, everything had subtly shifted. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but it was undeniable. He moved through the tasks with purpose, no longer feeling the need to prove something with every action. Instead, he found himself focusing on being the kind of soldier and the kind of man who could face any challenge with clarity and calm. His interactions with the younger soldiers had changed as well. Where there had once been competition and rivalry, now there was a quiet respect, not just for him, but for each other. One afternoon, as Liam sat in the common area, cleaning his gear, he overheard a conversation between two of the newer recruits. "You know," one of them said, "Liam's different now. He doesn't act like he used to. I remember when he first got here, he was always trying to show he was the best." The other soldier laughed softly. "Yeah, but now, he just does his job, helps us when we need it. It's like he figured something out that the rest of us missed." Liam smiled to himself, hearing their words. He didn't need their recognition, but it was nice to know that the change he had made was being noticed. As the weeks passed, the base began preparing for a large exercise. It was a chance for all the teams to demonstrate their skills in a real-world simulation. Liam had always looked at these exercises as a way to prove himself, but this time, something felt different. As he stood with his team, preparing for the simulation, he didn't feel the usual pressure. Instead, he felt a quiet confidence. The kind that came from knowing that, win or lose, he had already grown beyond the need for validation. Eddie had been around less, spending most of his time in his quarters or helping out with quieter tasks. But the old man's presence was still felt. Every so often, Liam would catch a glimpse of Eddie walking the grounds, a steady figure moving with purpose and quiet strength. He had become a kind of guiding force, not through words or grand gestures, but through the way he carried himself. The day of the exercise arrived, and as Liam and his team took their positions, he noticed that the younger soldiers were looking to him, not for instructions, but for reassurance. They had seen the change in him, and now they were beginning to trust it. As the exercise unfolded, Liam moved through it with a calm that surprised even him. There were obstacles, of course, but instead of rushing into action or overthinking every decision, he simply reacted. He made the right calls when needed, but he also knew when to step back and let others take charge. The exercise ended, and the team was called together for debriefing. Liam stood with the rest of them, his posture relaxed, but his mind sharp. The feedback was positive, not just for the team's performance, but for the way they worked together. There was no individual standout this time. It had been a collective effort, and it felt right. As the meeting broke up and everyone started to head off, Liam caught Eddie's eye. The old man gave him a small nod, nothing grand, but it was enough. Liam smiled back, understanding that the true measure of success wasn't in how well he had performed, but in how much he had grown, and how much he had helped others grow. As he walked back to his quarters, Liam knew that the journey was far from over. There would always be challenges, always be moments where he would have to dig deeper than before. But for the first time, he wasn't looking to prove anything. He was simply looking to be the man he knew he could be, the man he was already becoming.